Hi, everybody. Welcome to the first actual literature lecture on Disney and children's literature. I'm happy that you're here. Let me share my screen so we can begin. All right. So we're talking about Cinderella in the kind of pre-lecture materials. You should have reflected on your personal take on Cinderella. Where have you encountered it? Have you encountered it in literature form? Have you always encountered it in movies? Kind of along those lines. So keep those in the front of your mind while you listen to this lecturette. So, Cinderella, fairy godmothers, glass slippers, pumpkin carriages, and birds that peck people's eyes out. What's this about? So, first, what's the story? So, the Cinderella story, or, trope almost kind of has a general, synopsis. It's about a girl who may or may not be orphaned and subject to live with her stepmother. She is not treated very well. Her stepmother is evil. Her stepsisters are evil. They make her do chores around the house. Come to flash forward to the princess having a ball to try to find a suitor, a wife, to rule a kingdom with. And Cinderella really wants to go. She makes this dress and she's all excited to go. She puts it on the day of the ball and she comes out, and her stepmother ruins her dress and says, "You're not going to the ball. You can only go to the ball if you finish these chores." There's kind of different renditions of the story. And so Cinderella is very heartbroken, and she is forced to stay home and clean, and she has talking animals in Disney's version that kind of try to console her and help her with her chores. Then out of the blue comes the fairy godmother, who comes down and grants Cinderella these wishes, and helps her get dressed for the ball. We kind of see that in the lower middle image. And she gets this beautiful dress and this pumpkin carriage with horses to take her to the ball. And she sets off for the ball, thanking her fairy godmother for all that she's done. She gets to the ball, and the prince, she catches the prince's eye, and they spend a wonderful night together dancing and talking. But the magic that the fairy godmother used expires, and the clock strikes, and Cinderella's got to leave. She's got to run. And so she leaves, and in the process, she leaves one of her glass slippers, which is what we see in the lower left image there. She leaves one of her glass slippers. Well, the prince doesn't catch Cinderella on her way out, but he does catch this glass slipper. So he goes through the village the next day trying to figure out who Cinderella is. And so he goes to the house with Cinderella, her stepmother, and her evil stepsisters. And the stepsisters are eager to try on the slipper. It doesn't fit. And the prince is like, "Is there anyone else in this house that could have been at the ball?" And the stepmother's like, "No." And then Cinderella comes around the corner, and he puts the slipper on her, and it fits. He found his one true love, and they all live happily ever after. So this is kind of a typical story in children's literature. Some of the themes that we've been talking about in class are very evident in this story. And this story is kind of like an outline for many stories, kind of like the standard Disney princess almost, is Cinderella. And so to begin, the history of Cinderella. So the Disney film is actually based off of Cendrillon by Charles Perrault, which was published in 1597 in France. And there are many elements similar to the Disney adaptation. So we've got the fairy godmother, magical pumpkins, the glass slipper, kind of the midnight deadline, we gotta go, we gotta race home. But the actual Cinderella story can be traced all the way back to the Greeks and Egyptians of Rhodopis. And so the basic summary is a girl ends up marrying an Egyptian king after a bird comes, steals her shoes, and drops it in the king's lap, who's forced to find her to return the shoe. He falls in love with her, and she marries the Egyptian king. Um, Additionally, the brothers Grimm had their own Grimm take on the tale, titled Aschenputtel. So Cinderella's wishes come from a tree growing from her mother's grave. In this version, her father is still alive. There are gold slippers, not glass slippers. In an attempt to fit into the slipper, the evil stepsisters cut off their toes. On the way to the wedding of Cinderella and the prince in the end, doves come and poke out the eyes of the stepsisters. So we kind of see definitely a grimmer take on the tale, and those details were not included in Disney's version. And this is really interesting to look at because we see a whole range of this story coming in different versions and different editions, different details that are produced by different cultures. And so this is really interesting to look at. And it's also really important to note that there really isn't one first Cinderella story. There's just many different versions. There's obviously Cendrillon, which was the primary inspiration for the Disney film, but obviously there were no talking animals. Those kind of things were added on by Disney, which we'll talk about later. And so Disney's adaptation came in 1950, and this was kind of a saving grace for the Walt Disney Company. So this was due to World War II. The Walt Disney Company had suffered some major losses. It had fallen out with many European film markets, and it was just kind of suffering altogether as a company trying to make films. And so Disney released Fantasia and Pinocchio, which both did not perform well at the box office, and it kind of looked like Disney was about to go out of business. But Cinderella was Disney's last chance, and it's often conjectured that if Cinderella had not performed as well as it did, the Disney company would have gone under. So this is kind of a very instrumental piece of Disney's history. And it shows in their theme parks, in all of their kind of marketing tools. If we think of some of the Disney logos, obviously we think of the Mickey Mouse ears, but we also think of Cinderella's castle. Cinderella's castle is huge at Disney World and Disneyland. It's one of the main attractions, just like what we talked about in the previous lecture on Disney's history. But it's also part of that logo, those introduction to the movies, that Cinderella's castle that we see. And so Disney's Cinderella was an instant hit. 5 years after Cinderella's release, Disney opened Disneyland, which indicates a certain degree of financial security. Disneyland was the first park opened in California, just as a little reminder. And so here on the right, we see the film poster, the original film poster. So Cinderella, a love story with music, the greatest since Snow White, color by Technicolor. So remember in the last lecture, we were talking about different technologies that Disney helped introduce into the film industry. Technicolor was one of those. And I really like this part at the top that says for all the world to love. Obviously, they were coming out of World War II. It was kind of a very depressing time economically and just all over. It was a very rough time. And so this was supposed to be a movie that was kind of supposed to bring America and the United States out of its little slump. And so moving on. So we see many changes in the Disney adaptation. Helpful animals. So in Perrault's version of the story, there are no helpful animals. Cinderella had absolutely no friends in the Parrots version, where it was really accentuating her isolation. She was completely alone. The Grimm Brothers version includes friendly animals, birds and mice alike. They don't have as much of a role, but Disney added these friendly animals, and it's often regarded as one of the most comedic elements of the film. Many people love these animals, love the addition. It definitely appeals to a child audience, just like we've talked about in our discussion on fables and folklore, the inclusion of animals. And these are just a really beloved piece of Cinderella's history. And it's really interesting that it wasn't included, and it was detail that was added on later on in the production process. So then the silly king is also another part. So in Pearl's version of the king, there's little mention of the king, not really any mention at all. The mentions are kept strictly formal. But Disney's adaptation makes fun of the king. He has a ridiculous temper. He's kind of just this character that you can poke fun at. And a lot of people have asked, you know, is this a subtle jab at monarchy? The elements of the monarchy are not as prevalent in the Disney adaptation as they are in the story. Those ideas are just kind of, for lack of a better term, just, you know, dumbed down a little bit, because obviously an American audience would not be that familiar with a monarchy for a government, especially children. And so it is interesting to look at this as if it is a piece of political commentary as a kind of subtle jab at monarchy. Some more changes in the adaptation. In Pearl's version, the ball lasts 2 nights, but in the movie adaptation for Disney, it only lasts 1 night. And so this is kind of interesting, because this is a major character arc kind of thing. So the prince becomes slowly fascinated with Cinderella in Pearl's version. He notices her, he talks to her, but he doesn't dance with her until the 2nd night of the ball. And so we kind of have some pacing in this story, but it's interesting that this was taken out in Disney's version, especially because with a film, you kind of have to make it last longer. But they obviously found it best to not include this 2nd night of the ball. And the relationship with the stepsisters is kind of one of the final changes in the adaptation. In Pearl's version, in the end, Cinderella gives her stepsisters a home at the end and finds credible suitors for them. So it's kind of like a return back, and just, you know, she, even though they were really mean to her and did really bad things to her, she finds them suitors and a home. But in the end, in the Grimm's brother version, you know, we see their eyes get pecked out. So we definitely see some different attitudes towards the stepsisters there. But in the film, the stepsisters storyline ends with the story practically. There's no further mention of their relationship with Cinderella, if she does give them a home, if they attend the wedding, etc. So it is interesting to see how that relationship is carried out throughout the story. And so here are my sources. I really hope you enjoyed. I want you to move on to those kind of post lecture reflection questions. Think about what you learned. Does this change what you think about Cinderella at all? And absolutely, if you have any questions, my contact information will be posted to the site, and I would be more than happy to talk more about Disney's version of Cinderella. Thank you. I will see you next for Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs.